Todd, who is director of the project Khalid, and he's going to talk to us about the book of Khalid on its 100th anniversary. Todd himself did his work at Harvard and at the Maxwell School. He worked with Samuel Huntington, and he is now working as director of this project about a little-known person whom we're shortly going to know a lot more about, as we all should. So welcome to Princeton.
Do you want to shut the door?
Yeah.
I guess, although you might want to put a sign or something. I don't know if it's...
People
People will know. Yeah, they'll know. So. Okay.
Don't lock it.
Yeah, just leave it like that. That's good.
Well, this project starts with what I consider to be a great cultural tragedy, and that is the lack of general awareness and even some specialist awareness of this figure, Ameen Rihani. And this is a man who, without any formal education, no university training, really no even a high school education, became a great poet, writer in both Arabic and English of numerous works, novels, collections of poetry, aphorisms, newspaper articles, essays, philosophical writings, considered to be a major writer in both English and Arabic. Became the voice, really, of the United States to the Arab world in the 1920s and 30s, the sort of representative of the American opinion for the kings of the region who they could trust, and simultaneously in the United States, the public intellectual who represented the Arab cause, the Syrian cause, and eventually the Palestinian cause, really, in the United States. Also, a major political figure in the Middle East, and a leading public intellectual in the United States, somebody who worked on treaties for Arab kings, who was considered the philosopher of Africa and was consulted upon by most of the leading political revolutionaries, intellectuals, figures throughout the Middle East. People would go to him because of his independence. And finally, a man who, in my opinion, basically predicted the 20th century. People have called him the apostle of the Arab-American relationship. Somebody who 100 years ago laid out the pitfalls that face the world today in terms of the potential for the Arab-American relationship, which was lost, but still had some early birth within the Saudi relationship, which he actually helped to initiate, and warned about the dangers of American support for Zionism without some moderation and some wisdom in his approach, and finally the dangers of imperialism and failure of Arab unity. He had a very complex political program that's still being established. So his biography, though, is pretty much, I think, is overly unknown. For instance, there's until a few weeks ago, there wasn't even an Encyclopedia Britannica article on him. Just as a part of this project, I had to write the Encyclopedia Britannica article just by chance. But he was born in Africa in Lebanon, which is east of Beirut, in 1876, and he immigrated to New York City with his family to work in their merchant business at age 12. He went to school for only really 1 year, and then worked full time for his family from sort of a cellar in Lower Manhattan. Ironically, just blocks away from the World Trade Center in the community of Little Syria on Washington Street, which many people are unaware was the center for Arab immigration to the United States, turn of the century. When he became 18, 19, he wanted to go off and work for a year in acting in a Shakespearean theater troupe. Decided that he wanted a formal education, returned to New York and entered law school, but became ill and had enough with that for less than 1 year, and then moved to Lebanon, went back to Lebanon to sort of recuperate. There he studied the Arabic language, retaught himself formal Arabic, became immersed in classical Arabic poetry, and as a child he also had studied Western literature, American literature, was consumed with figures like Emerson and Thoreau, Walt Whitman, and began to write poetry while he was in Lebanon, and came back to the United States. This was in 1876, and returned to New York in 1899, and at that point he started to write for some of the early Arabic newspapers in New York and Philadelphia, newspapers that people are now looking back on as sort of the start of the Arab American literary movement. And in 1905, and that time he started experimenting with poetry. In 1905, he returned to Lebanon, and about that same time, and remember this is under Ottoman control. People don't know the history, but he started to introduce free verse poetry and experiment with free verse poetry. And for most people, consider him to be the first person to use free verse poetry in Arabic and to really formalize it. And that was inspired by Walt Whitman. So that in itself would make him an extraordinary figure to have introduced free verse poetry in the Middle East, and that actually became a claim to fame for him. In that period, while he was in the Middle East, while he was in Lebanon until 1910, 1911, he wrote the book of Khalid, a collection of essays called Rihaniat, which is very well known in the region, and did more of this free verse poetry, in addition to writing numerous essays about the direction of the Arab political situation with the Ottoman Empire. Returned to the United States in 1911, became very active in literature, writing numerous plays and novels, becoming active in writing about the Middle East in American Orientalist magazines of the period, and making himself the premier public intellectual of the Arab American movement. He was widely respected in New York City, would give talks, for instance, eventually would give talks on Zionism and other political questions of the day. And it would actually have debates in New York City in the 20s and the 30s after the Balfour Declaration about Zionism with the representatives of leading Zionist organizations that would be reported in the New York Times and other magazines. And the WASPs, at that time, Americans had this sort of natural affinity with the Arab world. It's sort of amazing today to look back at it, but people were enormously sympathetic to him, and he was very popular. And in the 20s, in 1922, he did something else amazing. He went to the Arabian Peninsula and sort of showed up and said that he wanted to write about the Arab region. And at this time, there was no real travel, there was no road system. He wandered through the Arabian Peninsula and met all of the kings and the representatives, and started very close friendships with the number of the leaders of the Arab world in the 1920s, the new kings who had emerged. In particular, and probably most notable, is Ibn Saud, who he initiated a very close friendship that resulted in about 60 letters of correspondence between the two of them. And there are people now who actually make the case that the Saudi decision to partner with the United States and to believe that they could trust the United States was partially because of the advice of Ameen Rihani. So just in that alone, again, he has had enormous impact on world history. And then after that period, he continued to write, continued to be active in politics, living in both the United States and in Lebanon, back and forth, and was considered a major figure, contacted presidents, kings, and esteemed by philosophers and major literary figures around the region. In my opinion, quite an impressive resume. But I consider myself, 5 years ago, I was living in New York City. I considered myself to be reasonably well-read, and I guess I had assumed that after September 11th in particular, a figure like this, who, although he was Maronite Christian, I should point that out, much of the thrust of his work was about unifying religion and was eliminating sectarianism and creating Arab unity, that there was no return to him, that there wasn't an attempt to resurrect him as a symbol of the Arab-American relationship. Irfan Shahid, for instance, the professor Georgetown, calls him the apostle of the Arab-American relationship, really the person who initiated it. But I don't think a lot of people, and I've learned this throughout this project, few people are aware of it. Even many specialists, even if they know of him, they may only know of his political work, or literature people may know some of his literary work, but not the breadth of it. And actually, the English language work is less known than the Arab language work. So I was living in New York in 2005, and I was just, I'm sure like many people, was very disturbed by the direction of the Arab-American relationship. And I still think we have terror alerts today that there's this sort of apocalyptic tone to things. And I consider myself sort of a sensitive soul who sort of tries to escape into creative works, things like literature. And so I went out in search of Rihani, and I just did Google searches about him, and I read about Arab American literature, and I read some work by Suhail Boushroui of the University of Maryland, who had talked about this novel, 1911, a novel about two teenagers, two Arab boys, who immigrate to New York City, have kind of extraordinary experiences in New York, and then go back to the Middle East and use their American experiences to argue for political progress and for cultural unity and religious unity in the Middle East. Very extraordinary theme that I thought applies today. So I went off to read it, and I discovered that it was very difficult to find this novel. There are not, no real major edition has been published since 1911. It's very hard to get a hold of. There's one edition that the Ameen Rihani Institute, an organization that's affiliated, that's devoted to his reputation, publishes in Lebanon, but it's not in libraries or stores in the United States. So I did a small thing. I put the work online in 2005. I made the first ebook of it. And I did that after to find it, I had to go to the New York Public Library in the public reading room, and I read it in one sitting, because I make the case that it's a great novel, and I think it has extraordinary significance. It's the story about, as I said, about a boy who comes to New York City in this region of Lower Manhattan near the World Trade Center, and has all of these interesting adventures. Two boys, actually. One of them is serious about making money and peddling in the streets of New York. That was sort of the standard Arab career at the time, was to peddle in the streets. And then the other boy, Khalid, gets involved in other things, explores American literature, explores the avant-garde cultural scene in New York, gets involved in Tammany Hall politics, and explores himself in the U.S. Halfway through the novel, they return to Lebanon, return to the region, and that boy, Khalid, goes to the mountains, sort of has a Jesus-like Zarathustra hermitage in the mountains, comes down and becomes sort of a prophet to the Arab world writ large about the political direction as they break free from the Ottoman Empire, and about the dangers of sectarianism in favor of religious unity. Again, very powerful themes. And in fact, those themes basically, most people inspired the work The Prophet by Gibran. Gibran actually did the illustrations for the book of Khalid, and there are some wonderful illustrations in the work. That thing on the handout, the little 1911 Khalid drawing, is one of Gibran's illustrations. Yeah, so that's one reason. The themes, I think, are extraordinarily relevant, and I could go even more involved in this, but I think it's natural that this question of this novel talks about the original promise of the Arab-American relationship, about ways that the American political structure can inspire the Arab world, and the way that we can overcome sectarian differences. I think all of those themes are relevant today. Second, literary reputation is a complex thing. You have people like Herman Melville, whose works were sort of ignored for a number of years, several decades after his death, until they were resurrected. And Rihani is a strange figure in the sense that he wrote most of his body of work in both English and Arabic, so he has his own different constituencies. In the United States, he was active in so many things that I don't think he was ever really adopted by any sphere that would assert his reputation. And also he's to some degree was so far ahead of the other Arab American writers, the so-called mahjar writers, that they didn't even really quite adopt him as one of his own. So his reputation has really been dependent on, and he also didn't have any children, which is another factor. So his nieces and nephews many of them, actually 3 of them live in the United States, have an organization that has been publishing his work for a number of years. But for some reason, which I can't understand, and I'm not even as a non-Arab, I felt that it was important, especially with the 100th anniversary of his major novel, English language novel, to do something.